there, you awakening wonders. Thanks for joining me on this voyage to truth and freedom. We've got a beautiful conversation for you today. I spoke at length with Gabor Maté. Are you going crazy? Are you an addict? Did you suffer a mental breakdown during the pandemic period? Are you having issues with substances, self-harm? Are you falling apart? Or is someone you love suffering? Gabor Maté, I believe, is the most important voice in addiction and mental health at the moment. We spoke about his book, The Myth of Normal, and we also talked about mental illness and how it's treated with pills rather than exploring the psyche of trauma that is the root of pain, how systems are designed to punish individuals who have trauma through addiction and generational oppression. Excitingly, we talk about Gabor's disagreements with Jordan Peterson and his psychological methodologies and his relationship with hallucinogens. You're going to love this conversation. Have a look. Stay Free with Russell Brand. See it first on Rumble.
Gabor, your new book, The Myth of Normal, I've read some of it because you were kind enough to have someone send me an advance copy, and like all books I enjoy most, I'm in it.
I wrote it for you.
But what it's a continuation of your important and beautiful work, analysing the complexity of the human psyche. And I've already told people that you're not a psychiatrist and you don't like people saying that you are, and that you're a normal family doctor. All right, I've already made that clear.
Well, whether I'm normal, that's another question. But I am a family physician. Yeah, I'm not a psychiatrist, which is a good thing.
Why?
Because psychiatrists are trained in a very narrow way. They're mostly these days they're trained in this biological model of mental illness, so that all human distress is medicalized and explained in terms of some inherent dysfunction of the brain, genetic and so on, for which there's no proof whatsoever. But it reduces treatment of mental health concerns to pills and medications. And they just are not trained, I'm talking for the most part, to look at how life experience actually shapes the brain itself, and how life experience is what underlines people's mental distress. And furthermore, there's an assumption in mental health diagnoses, an assumption is that they explain why people suffer, but they don't. It's totally circular. So I've been diagnosed with ADHD. So they say Gabor has ADHD. How do we know that Gabor has ADHD? Because he tends to tune out and he's got trouble sitting still. Why does Gabor tune out and have trouble sitting still? Because he's got ADHD. How do we know he's got ADHD? Because he tunes out and he's got trouble sitting still. Or Gabor is depressed. How do we know? Because he's got a low mood and is isolating. Why is he isolating and has a low mood? Because he's got depression. How do we know he's got depression? Because it's totally circular. So these diagnoses, they may describe things, they don't explain anything, and they certainly cannot be reduced to biological events in the brain.
It's fascinating that you say that, because I suppose these diagnostics become more complex when dealing with neurology and when dealing with behaviour. When diagnosing, I suppose, a broken arm, you can observe, the arm is broken. But when you're dealing with complexity within the mind, it seems like what you're saying is there's a tendency to problematize it and extract the reasons why these behaviours might be exhibited, or this phenomena might be exhibited. And also I've noticed a tendency to extract social conditions and make the individual culpable through the process of diagnosis.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is true not only of what they call mental illness, but also physical health. For example, in Canada where I live, an indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis, 6 times the risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis now than anybody else. Now, this is in a population that never used to have any autoimmune disease, let alone rheumatoid arthritis. Now, their rate is 6 times. Now, the average physician is trained to understand rheumatoid arthritis as a physical event of the immune system turning against the body and damaging the joints and the connective tissues and so on. Why that happens, when you actually study people's lives, and the scientific evidence has to do with people's lives and their social existence. Why indigenous people in Canada? Because they're the most oppressed and the most stressed and the most traumatized segment of the population. And that has everything to do with the physiology of rheumatoid arthritis. Or women and multiple sclerosis. In the 1930s, the gender ratio of multiple sclerosis was 1 to 1. Now it's 3.5 women for every man, which immediately tells us It can't be genetic, because genes don't change in a population in 80 years. Can't be the environment or the climate, or can't be the climate or the food, because that didn't change more for one gender than the other. What is it? When you look at who develops multiple sclerosis, is people who suppress their own needs, who serve the needs of others ahead of their own, who don't know how to express or even experience healthy anger, who tend to be very, very nice people, to have trouble saying no. In other words, precisely the characteristics that this society encourages in women, and who absorb the stresses of other people. And what's happened in the last 80 years is that women are still playing that role of emotional caregivers to their families and their spouses and their children, of course, and their parents. But they also have to make a living out there in the work world. And they're under more stress because there's more isolation. The more isolated people are, the more stressed they are. So there's no big mystery. But from the point of view of biological causation, there's no explanation. So only if, as you suggest, we look at the social conditions and cultural environment in which people live their lives, can we understand why people are ill. And this is, despite all the science that buttresses what I'm telling you, is completely ignored in medical practice.
My assumption would be, Gabor, because that immediately politicizes these matters of health, and then it becomes an indicator that there are social power dynamics at play, even when it comes to something as observable and rudimentary as physical health, let alone the complexity that we started on with matters regarding mental health. Now, it seems like you're willing and able to underwrite the more complex aspects of mental health diagnosis with these physical examples. What else are you demonstrating in your book, The Myth of Normal? I know because I've read bits of it, well, the bits where my name's in it. I've read loads of it. What else are you talking about when it comes to like addiction and mental health and the social and political aspect of these conditions?
Yes. So, again, the addiction assumption in society in general is that it's a choice that people are making. In fact, the whole legal system is based on the assumption that people are choosing to behave in certain ways, consciously choosing. So they're consciously choosing to become addicted to illegal substances. That's the assumption in the legal system. Therefore, I argue that when we call it a criminal justice system, it's a really good name for it. It's a criminal justice system because it's criminally stupid in its assumptions. I've never met anybody, and I've worked with really hardcore substance users, who actually woke up one morning and said, "Oh, my ambition is to become a drug addict." That's the first point. Second point is that the medical assumption that we're dealing with an inherited brain disease is equally false. So that there's very little evidence, despite what they say, for any genetic causation of addiction. What we're really looking at, and let's just do a little experiment here. I'll give you a definition of addiction and get you to participate. I'm speaking to the audience here and also to my interviewer. I'll define addiction as manifested in any behavior in which a person finds temporary pleasure or relief, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So pleasure, relief, and craving in the short term, harm, and inability to give up in the long term. Now notice I said nothing about drugs. I said any behavior. So it could be substances, cocaine, crystal meth, caffeine, nicotine, whatever, alcohol, heroin. Yes, also gambling, shopping, sex, pornography, eating, self-cutting, anorexia, bulimia, work, internet, gaming, extreme sports. The issue is not the behavior as such, it's the internal relationship to it. If there's craving, pleasure, and relief in the short term, harm in the long term, and you're not giving it up, you got an addiction. I don't care what to. So here's what I want to ask here from the audience is if by that definition, you recognize that at one time or another, you've had any kind of an addiction, just raise your hand. Okay, so what we've got here is the vast majority, if not everybody, okay? Now here's what I'm going to ask you now. I don't know if this works for the podcast purposes. I'm going to ask some of you to tell me, not what was wrong with your addiction, which you already know, but what was right about it. What did it give you in the short term that you craved, that you wanted?
We'll cover that later, right? Just for the structuring and production of our podcast, because that is one of your great edicts and one of the, what I would call Maté's maxims, that I've coined that. When analyzing addiction, I'm in a program of recovery. I talk to other addicts all of the time, and it's a very helpful tool to invite someone that is dealing with chemical dependency or any form of addiction. Don't assess the many negative consequences of addiction. Look at what it does for the addict, the positive purpose that it serves. Right. And it's yours, and I like it. I use it all the time, and I usually credit you for it, depending on if I'm trying to impress the person or not. When I'm with my own behaviors, I'm looking sometimes for connection, distraction, a sense of self-worth, validation, escape. These are all motivations.
So escape from what?
Pain.
Right. So hence my mantra, not why the addiction, but why the pain. And so what I'm saying is, just as you've articulately illustrated, the addictions, these qualities, connection, self-worth, pain relief, are they good things or bad things?
The good things.
Yeah. In other words, addiction, the addicted person just wants to feel like a normal human being. So addiction is neither a choice, nor is it a disease. It's an attempt to solve the problem. And that problem is rooted in trauma. So once we recognize that, why are we judging people for desperately seeking to escape states of extreme emotional distress, isolation, disconnection, pain? So the addiction is not the primary issue. The primary issue is the trauma that induces the mind state from which the person needs to escape. And now if you look at it from the population and the political point of view, like for example under COVID, just to give a recent instance, alcoholism went up, addiction, drug use went up, all kinds of addictive behaviors went up. Why? Because when people are stressed and they have not the means to resolve their stress, they'll resort, amongst other things, to addictive behaviors. Now that has all kinds of political implications, because if you look at least in the United States, and I bet if you did a class analysis here in Britain of who's in jail because of addictions, addicted-related behaviors, in the States it's largely minority people by a huge disproportionate percentage. In Canada, 30% of the people in our jails are Indigenous people. 30% of my clients in the addicted area of Vancouver where I worked were Indigenous people. They make up 4% of the Canadian population, 30% of the jail population, and Indigenous women make up 50% of the Canadian jail female population, 4% of the general population. What are we looking at? We're looking at historical oppression and trauma and ongoing racism. And that's what manifests in that need to escape. Now, does the medical profession take that into account? Does the legal profession even know about it? We just keep punishing people for how we make them hurt. We're punishing people for how we made them suffer. And I bet in Britain here, if you did a class analysis of who's in jail, it's not going to be the upper crust.
Yes. And of course, the reason to answer, I imagine, a rhetorical question that was laced within your answer, the reason that you cannot desist from identifying the individual as the primary culprit in criminal activity when it comes to addiction is because the minute you challenge that paradigm, you are confronted with these issues are socially and politically created, and it becomes a challenge to power to resolve the problem. As long as it's individual nodes that are culpable rather than an underlying social issue, you don't have to alter society. And so a difficult question is never asked. One of the broader questions, Gabor, when I was preparing for this conversation using my mind, prior to being here, I used my mind, I went inside it, and I thought, what do I want to ask Gabor Maté? Because there'll be a moment when I'm looking into his eyes, and now that moment is happening. And this was the question: how long do you think we can continue to extract compassion and spiritual solutions that recognize the ulterior oneness from our ongoing ideas around change? How long can we continue to extract the idea that there needs to be a spiritual and compassionate component to the way that we organize society? How long can we continue to have economics as the heart of our political and ideological systems? And what well, let's just answer that question, I suppose, first, because follow-up was quite an intense question. And how do we, I suppose, move these ideas to the center? And is that part of the objective of your book?
Well, so if I may just step around the question for a moment and then come back to it. This phenomenon that you described, this extraction of the social, political, the spiritual, the experiential from particular problems, it goes way beyond the question of addiction.
Yes.
Your blessed former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, once talked about the problem of obesity. And obesity is a rising problem in the Western world. And in Britain, it's a huge problem. It's a huge health problem. And he said, this is not a public health issue. It's a decision. It's a result of millions of individual decisions. Well, what Tony Blair, in his neoliberal wisdom, utterly ignored was that since the instigation of neoliberal policies, which increase inequality, which put more stress on the lower classes, obesity has become epidemic. It's a stress response.
Yes.
It's not an individual. Those individual decisions that he talks about are actually formed by social forces of which he is a prime representative.
Yes.
How long that can continue? Well, you know, I was just reading a bit of a book, The Social Distance Between Us by Darren McGarvey, a book that you endorsed. And he says on the third page a line that could have been taken from my book, The Myth of Normal. And he says that, he's talking about pre-COVID days, and he says that the normal to which we would all like to return in a heartbeat was anything but. And that line could have come out of my book, The Myth of Normal. And how long? Well, I can only tell you, as long as we're willing to let them get away with it. And it's not a question of willingness to let them get away with it, as long as people have wool over their eyes and they don't see reality. And my intention in writing this book, and you know this view that I have of you, Russell, as well, as that what you ultimately committed to is you're committed to truth, you know, and that's all I'm trying to say is just what is true about life, what is true about human beings, what is true about what we call human nature, what is true about relationships, what is true about health, illness, and so on. People can be kept from the truth for a long, long time. And I don't know at what point a society will get to the point of suffering where the majority will say enough. Because for the minority that actually is reaping the benefits, there's no problem whatsoever. So when we talk about the system being broken, no, it's not.
Yes. This is a challenge that we continually face, is that situations that we would diagnose or recognize as problematic are for the most powerful interests in the world advantageous.
Yeah.
This also, Gabor, already this conversation demonstrates the impossibility of remaining politically neutral when talking about something that previously and actually is still contemporarily presented as a mental health and individual issue, but is anything but that, and requires radical and immediate political action to be addressed, immediate mobilization, radical transformation of consciousness, reorganization of the world of finance, reorganization of our political systems. This obviously helps us to understand why these questions are presented in the way they are and answered in the manner that they consistently are. Because before too long, you have to radicalize an entire population and invite them to not participate in systems that are primarily about inducing compliance and subjugation, and present themselves as solutions. As the radical hallucinogenic pioneer Terence McKenna was fond of saying, the culture is not your friend. The culture is not your friend. It presents itself as your friend. Here are some products for you. Here are some projects for you. Here are some entertainments and distractions. But the system requires you dumb and numb and distracted and complacent. I suppose to sort of follow up a little on my question, I suppose that we have to become, I know that Jordan Peterson, for example, would be a person that you would be at odds with a lot. I sense this in some ways.
Who's that?
Jordan, Professor Peterson, you know, Jordan Peterson, he's been on this podcast a bunch of times. And in some ways, I consider you similar figures.
Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
There's nothing I agree with him about anything. What is but you're not the first one to say that you notice some similarities. So what is it that you notice?
He's infusing political discourse with psychiatric, in his case,
Yeah.
understanding, with information that's coming